Hello, 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 everyone. My name is Armina Domingue. I am a member of Azule Consulting Group, and that's who's presenting to you guys today. We're going to talk a little bit about some things. And so, again, I'm Armina Domingue, and I brought along with me Brandy Walker and Stacy Heath. And so I'm going to turn it over to Brandy to just talk a little bit. Matter of fact, before Brandy, I even bring you in, I'm going to bring Stacy in. I think Stacy has an announcement or something she wants to say first.
Yes, thanks, Armina. Good morning, everyone. So first, I just wanted to say thank you for having us and just to say happy Pride Month. So we know that June is Pride Month and we are looking forward to all the celebrations that are happening and the parades and just the acknowledgement of the last 53 years that we've been celebrating and acknowledging Pride Month. So again, happy Pride Month, and I wish you all a safe and happy holiday.
Thank you. Brandy, why don't you tell us a little bit about what the folks can expect from our webinar today?
Yeah, so we will be talking about transforming our loss into purpose. And some of the things that we will be focusing on include education around finding purpose and meaning in life after experiencing a loss, impacts of grief and loss, ways to cope with grief and loss. So as we're talking through some of this information, and we will our presentation will be more of a conversation style. We found that to be more effective when doing webinars because it allows you to relate more to the information. It allows you to relate to more of the content that's being covered. So in addition to it being a conversation style, the information that you'll be exposed to, you'll notice a theme all throughout our presentation, all throughout the slides, a lot of things that seem to overlap, but I just want you to remember to take that as a means of saying that that is very important for you to take away. So just keeping that in mind as we go through these slides.
Absolutely.
There's a statement here that you can see, and we thought that this was a powerful statement for our presentation that really kind of conceptualizes what we are going to be presenting on. So as you see here, it says discovering purpose and significance while confronting death is a private and unique experience. So you'll hear us say over and over again during this presentation that this process of grief and loss is very unique to you as an individual. It doesn't look the same for each and every person. It encompasses converting grief into an opportunity for growth and resilience.
So as we're looking at this whole webinar and talking about transforming lives and even thinking about purpose, we're going to hit on a few things. So we're going to hit on acknowledging and expressing feelings. We're going to talk through what seeking support looks like. We're going to talk about personal healing, empowerment through advocacy. What is that? How do you even do that? Helping others, pursuing education and career. Maybe this is the thing that sparks your interest in getting into the field. And then living a fulfilling life. You know, Stacy, as we were talking this through, you said such a profound statement about life doesn't stop for the griever because they've lost someone, right? And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. I can't wait to hear your perspective on it. And so, ladies, let's talk about what is acknowledging and expressing feelings. We hear the feeling words all the time. We hear emotions all the time. But what does that feel like? What does it seem like? How do we even do that?
Well, I think, when you think about grief and loss and expressing feelings and emotions, like Brandy, indicating, like you said, like it's unique to each and every person. So it is going to look very different. For some people, it's an outward expression, right? That involves like crying and sobbing and just kind of sitting with those emotions. And for others, it can definitely feel more introverted, where, you know, you're just kind of sitting with the memories, sitting with the thoughts of that person, and just kind of trying to understand what has happened, understand the loss, think about what does life look like now that this person has transitioned. So I think those emotions, there's so many emotions that happen, and they can just, you know, hit you at a variety of times and just look very different, depending on your relationship with the person and just how you typically express your emotions and feelings.
That's a very good point. I always think of grief as like if you were to hit your toe on the corner of like somebody's wooden furniture. I might be dating myself, but you know, and that initial hurt, the stinging of it, and it does get better, but it just takes a while. And throughout the day, you feel literally like the pain is subsiding. So by the end of the day or the time where the pain has subsided, it doesn't feel nearly as much as it did before. I realized though, when I stub my toe, if I immediately grab the toe and put pressure on it or squeeze on it, when I release the toe, the pressure or the pain, I should say, is not as much as it was in the beginning. And so obviously my thinking on that has to do with when we lose someone or something very close to us or very dear to us, and we don't deal with the pain right away, it doesn't just disappear. You know, like you said, Stacy, I can recall times when I'm sitting at a light after losing a loved one or even losing a job, and something at that intersection, whether it's someone passing, whether it's a song I hear in someone else's car, or just seeing something reminds me of the thing I lost or the person I've lost. And those emotions come like a rushing well, you know? So suppressing it, I do think some of us, that's what we do because that's all we know, but it's not necessarily the most healthiest outlet for dealing and coping and being on the journey. Brandy, talk to us a little bit about some of those healthy outlets to express those emotions. Like, what are some of the things that you tell your clients? What are some things you've done on your own?
Yeah, and I wanted to mention just about as far as like suppressing, you know, when we think about grief and losing something or someone, that initial shock, it's really hard to put into words what I am feeling. What am I feeling?
Right.
You know, I haven't completely processed what even happened. I don't even believe what just happened. So when we're talking about expressing our feelings, I just wanted to put out there that it's okay to just say, I don't know what I'm feeling, but because that's still vocalizing something, right? Even if a lot of people, I think, find it might be easier, like you use the analogy of the toe, it could be easier to vocalize an analogy of how you may be feeling. I feel like an empty well right now. I feel hopeless right now. I feel uncomfortable or not knowing what to do. So I just want to make sure that when we're saying acknowledge and expressing how you feel, it doesn't mean you have to really know the exact emotion or feeling word, right? It's just a matter of expressing whatever's coming to your mind so that you're not holding that in. And so that kind of speaks to these more healthy outlets of journaling, or talking to someone, like we're talking about vocalizing these things. And it doesn't always have to be to someone. That's why you have these other outlets such as journaling. And what I usually have my clients do is I usually have them write a letter to their loved one. It could be from the frame of a goodbye stance. But I always encourage them to be reflective about that person, be reflective about that thing that you might have lost, and then kind of close that letter with a goodbye and what you'll miss, but also what are you looking forward to moving through life without them, or how you may memorialize them going forward. So as you see here, there's other options such as, participating in support groups. And I know we'll get into some additional ways as we go through the rest of the presentation.
As you were talking, I sort of thought of, I hear all the time in my sessions with clients, I feel some type of way, or I feel some way, and really helping them unpack that. Because sometimes they have it, they just need it pulled out, right? And so being able to help, like, well, what is some type of way? What kind of way? What does that look like? What does that feel like? Does this feel like anything else you've ever experienced? What was the thing you experienced? And trying to, like you said, make that connection so that they understand the feeling and the emotion. And when you can put words to it, it really helps. And the other thing that helps too is, what is your belief about death, right? And I know, like, we didn't come to talk about that today, but if you can sort of pull on that, it'll help you to then acknowledge the emotions and feelings you're having. If you think that the dead person is now in a higher place looking down at you, or become a guardian angels walking side by side with you, or is just dead, like no life whatsoever, your feelings and your emotions will change, because now this is how you're gonna sort of embrace the relationship moving forward. So yeah, so I agree. I think being able to participate in support groups and finding someone you can talk to. Some of us may think no one understands, or people don't understand what we're dealing with, but it's important to find your person. Or journaling, but get it out. Essentially what we're saying is get those feelings and emotions out, because they become like the bottle. If you shake the Coke and you open it up, or the soda, you open it up, it just goes everywhere. We don't want that for you guys. So being able to talk through some of that is super important. And so as we're looking at that, talking with someone, finding a support, what can we say as people are searching for that trusted person to talk to? What do we want are some of those characteristics for those people to be?
We
Stacey?
essentially, go ahead. You're going to have Stacey.
You can go right ahead, Brandy.
No, I was just going to say that we essentially want them to be able to listen. I think through many conversations that we have with people, and the common question is, or statement that most people feel like they need to say when they know someone has experienced the losses: if there's anything you need, let me know. And as through our conversation, being the person that's grieving, it's really hard to identify what you actually need. So you have all these people that are extending that olive branch to you, but you don't really know how to utilize them. And so sometimes it could just be that person just to be present. So maybe you don't have to say anything to each other, but just a person that can just be there throughout, after the funeral and all of that, but that just pops up just to be a presence for you. So if there's anything that you need to vocalize, you have that person. Or if you just need a person, a body there with you, that plays a big part. Somebody that can be empathetic, right? So that they can truly understand what you're going through and not be passive about it, or not trying to rush you through your process either. Because in their mind, okay, you should be over this by now. So I think those are some of the key pieces that when you're seeking support, and even through support groups, I think that's important too. If you're looking for a specific support group, maybe that's dealing with grief and loss, and it may be the type of loss. You may be looking for a certain support group for that. When we were talking about this, there may not be specific ones that are like physically around you, but social media has become a big thing where you can find a lot of different type of groups that you can be a part of. and that can serve as a support for you, which can be really great, especially because these are people that don't really know you. But you guys are all joining together because of you experience the same thing.
And that's so true. You say that. I remember about 10 years ago, and it's crazy how within 10 years, social media has like blown. I actually think in this pandemic, the platform for social media has like really gone way beyond what we thought it would ever be. But I had a major loss, and it was my previous husband. And I was looking for a very specific group. I was a young widow with no children. So I was looking for that. And all of the widows group I found were seasoned people who had lost their loved ones, you know, at the very end of the stage or like later on in life. And I just couldn't gel with that. Like I could not get with it. I didn't feel like I could relate to the people in the room. And then when I did try to talk to my trusted friends, they were so concerned about me that I felt like it was really about me. They were not neutral in the situation. So their hardness on me getting over it and saying things about that was because they cared that I was very sunken into my grief. But I found a therapist, and that was like the best thing for me. Now, as a clinician, I am pro therapy all the way. You just got to find the right one. Not every therapist is for everyone. That's my commercial plug. But I found someone who really walked me through this journey. And it was crazy because we got to an intersection in the road and we looked at each other and we said, so buddy, I guess this is where we part ways. It wasn't that I still didn't need therapy, but I just needed her for that time to get me to the next stage where then I found another therapist to then help me to cope with him no longer being here. The first person was to help me accept that he's no longer here. And what did those things encompass? And then it was, now that I've accepted that he's no longer here, how do I cope? How do my life continue that it doesn't have to stop right here? And so that's a very great point that you bring up. Stacey, anything you want to add to seeking support?
You're on mute, Stacey.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep. There you
Okay,
go.
I don't know what happened. I'm sorry. I think that everything that you said is definitely, definitely on the right track. I think the only thing that I would add to that is when you talk about seeking support and a trusted friend, I think the importance is the person understanding the relationship between you and the person that has transitioned, right? Because I think, to Armina's point, understanding you're a young widow, right? That looks very different than having like this very long marriage and this long time together. So I think having a person that understands the intimacy of the relationship between you and the deceased also helps them to be a trusted support, right? To understand maybe, this is not a process that you will be able to get over in this expected amount of time, but that, because of that relationship, there just needs to be some added layers of support there. So I think that's super important. There's difference when you lose a parent, when you lose a spouse, if you lose a child, if you lose a friend. So I think when you seek support, just having that as a part of the person and the criteria that you look for is important.
And I kind of want to hear from the audience that's with us today. We're talking about this whole idea and notion about grief and loss, and we want to know a couple of things from you guys. So if you're able to, obviously if you're driving, we want you to keep driving unless you're going to pull over and stop the car. But if you're able to, we want you to utilize your chat box. And so I'm going to ask you 3 questions. You're going to put them in there and then we'll continue on. So the first question is, put a 1 in the box. That's a number 1. If you have experienced a loss in the past year, put a 1 in the box if you've experienced a loss in the past year. And that could be a loss, not necessarily of a person, but it could be a thing. It could be a pet. It can be anything that was dear to your heart that is no longer with you. And then I want you to put a number 2 in the box. If you're familiar with the concept of self-care and have used it to help cope with the loss. So a number 2, if you know what self-care is and you use self-care to cope with your loss. I see some of the numbers are coming in. And then last one is put a number 3. If you have been the primary support for someone who's experienced a loss in their life. And then put a number 4 if this is brand new topic, brand new concept for you. Ladies, how are we looking in the chat box? I'm seeing some of the numbers coming in.
Yeah, the numbers are coming in. It looks like, for question number 2, we have quite a few people that are familiar with self-care and how they use that through grief and loss. And I think, right now it's looking like the greatest one is a person that has experienced loss in the last 6 months to a year. So, just evident that, seeking support and grief and loss is a part of our everyday lives. And how do we, take that information and how do we turn it into our purpose?
Absolutely. All right. Thanks, guys. You can still keep those coming in. Those numbers can still come in as we're going through the presentation. And don't you guys love technology? When it works, it works. When it doesn't, it just does not work. But here we go. So we've talked about acknowledging the feelings, and we've talked through finding support. Let's talk a little bit about personal healing. Any one of you can jump right in as we're talking about that. What is that? And I'm not sure what's happening with my PowerPoint. I'm feeling I should just stop and not make it any worse, but maybe we're on. Randy, give me some thoughts on personal healing. What is that?
Yeah, so in general, I know we're talking about specific to grief and loss, but there are plenty of things when we talk about personal healing that we may need healing from. This can include traumatic events in our lives, rough childhoods, or exposure to things. When we talk about the pandemic, that did a lot for a lot of people. It made a lot of people feel depressed or anxious or not hopeful about the future. So personal healing is more so about, when we, like you asked the question of self-care, it's more so of identifying what are those things that you need for yourself, and then moving forward to implement some of those things that you need for yourself, those things to help keep yourself grounded. So like on the slide, you see things like therapy and meditation and journaling. Therapy is very helpful because, like I mentioned before, sometimes it can be very hard to identify what you may need. And the therapy piece the therapist helps to kind of pull some of those things out. So most of us have an idea of what could be helpful, or what we actually need, but sometimes it can be hard to pull that out of ourselves. And so that's where that professional comes in, where they can help you navigate that and identify some of those things. So personal healing is an ongoing process that has to take place for your own self. It reminds me of closing up wounds for yourself. When you lose a loved one or a thing or a pet, it does make you feel like a void is there, in your heart. It feels like something a chunk has been taken out of your heart. But the personal healing is a way to essentially heal that openness, and bring some fullness back to it.
Yeah. I just would add to that, Brandy. I love that, and that, just kind of the examples that you gave. But when you spoke about, engaging with therapy and using a therapist to help you kind of identify those feelings, I think when we think about grief and loss, one of the things that, it's really hard to articulate, what am I feeling, right? It's really hard to even conceptualize and understand the loss of this person. So in that space, how do you even begin to think about healing? Like, you're in so much pain and it just feels so heavy for you. Healing is probably like the furthest thing from your mind. You can't even see to the next minute. So I think, engaging in therapy, engaging in journaling, and understanding that that healing is a process. It's not something that happens right away. Whereas I feel like sometimes with grief, loss, and death, sometimes death is very sudden. So there's no process. There's not always death that comes due to illness, but they're sudden. And so then you have this immediate life change that you have to adjust to. And there's a false expectation that there's a time frame, right? So just understanding that the healing process and the healing journey will look very different for every individual.
Absolutely. And to that point too, Stacey, as you were talking, the thought popped into my mind of being present, right? But
Yes.
let's not focus on, I just want to get through this, but just be present. And being present in the moment gives space and time for those emotions and those feelings to be adjusted or to be discovered or even to be acknowledged. I like the AAE on this page, which is A for allow yourself to grieve, A for acknowledge your emotions, and E to engage in activities. Those three things keeps us present so that we can kind of get through today. I know we got this week and next week and all of that, but if I can just make it through today, then there is a tomorrow. And then if I can make it through tomorrow, and before you know it, I've made it through the month, I've made it through 6 months, but I'm allowing myself to do these three things: to grieve, to acknowledge my emotions, and even engage in activities. I've shared with clients before, like, keep a notepad by your bed and just write, even if it doesn't make sense, just put it down. You can bring it in and we can try to make sense of it, or you can just write it and then trash it. You don't have to post it anywhere. You don't have to keep it anywhere. You don't have to take a picture of it and reflect later on, but it is a means to get things out. So absolutely. And then, we talk about empowerment through, oh, okay, it's working. Empowerment through advocacy. Can we talk about advocacy? Like, what is that? We hear that word often, or maybe not, but what is advocacy?
It's essentially supporting or fighting for something that you believe in. And so a lot of people, we have to advocate for ourselves. And particularly when we're talking about, because we're highlighting HIV and AIDS awareness, those are all things that individuals can be passionate about. And it's sort of, when you're talking about advocacy, it involves research to know what the current things or laws or regulations or biases are out there currently, and then determining what changes could potentially be made or what needs to happen, and how creating an action plan of how to make that be a reality, to create change. And so a lot of that is collaborating, partnerships with organizations, with like-minded people to make changes. But in the midst of this, when there's specific losses related to a more general thing, such as if it were HIV or AIDS or pandemic loss, those are areas where people can kind of group together to advocate for changes, to advocate for better treatment and things of that nature.
Yeah, I like that. And, I'm reminded, like, this platform right here is a sense of advocacy. There's a passion that Philly Fight has for particular communities to bring awareness to those that may not know so much about that community, bring awareness to HIV and AIDS and prevention and research and all the things that's out there. I remember when my previous husband passed away, and I keep saying previous because I since got married. So when my previous husband passed away, I took to Facebook because that was a social media platform out there. And every week I would share where I was in my journey. And at first it was because I didn't want, people kept calling and texting and I didn't want to talk. So I was like, well, if I use this platform, then whoever needs to know will know, right? At one time. But then it turned into, I was so passionate about getting help for things we'd lost because I was seeing the benefit of it, that I wanted people to see my journey, hear my story. And also the end is like, so this is how therapy has helped me. Do you think maybe you can try it? Would it help you? So advocacy sometimes is not just standing on the street corner, holding up a sign or going to a march, but it is just in your way, talking about the things that you've experienced, the losses you've experienced, sharing the story, because you never know who's listening. You never know who's reading, that you're giving them awareness. You're talking about prevention. And there were times when I talked about research in terms of like, I can't even find a support group for a 37-year-old widow. Like, I've searched all over, I've looked in my area, I can't find that. And so one person said to me, well, should you create a group? And I was like, oh, I never really thought of creating a group because I want to be in the group. I don't want to be a facilitator of the group. But I didn't create the group, but that was a good reminder that if we can't find what's out there, let's be empowered to create it. And it could start in a basement somewhere. It could start in a coffee shop somewhere. So you don't have to have like a building with a name on it to do that. So yeah, so when you said that, that did remind me of sharing your story and how that could help too.
Yeah.
So, and then I like the last part about the advocacy, it's not the only way to raise awareness, but it helps give you purpose. Because now that's that passion that's been burning in you, and that can turn and change into making a positive impact on the lives of so many others. So
I think that's a big part of advocacy as well. Just like, sometimes being that voice for folks that are struggling to express what they need. And when you've experienced a loss or you have a similar experience and you do feel stronger, so just being in the forefront and being that voice, I think that's really important as well.
Stacey, can you keep talking about the helping others piece and like how that ties into grief and loss?
Sure, absolutely. So I think when it comes to helping others, it's kind of inevitable that we all will experience loss in our lives. And so for some of us that have experienced loss, it can feel a tad bit easier to support another person. I know for me, I've experienced loss in my life. I've lost both my parents. And so as a clinician, when I have clients that come in that have experienced loss, I lean on my clinical expertise, but I also lean on my lived experience. And again, what did that look like? What are some of the things that helped me? So I offer that in my sessions. And so when you worked in specific populations, or you've experienced those losses yourself, you can lend that to the conversation and be a greater support to another person. I think educating ourselves, right? So as we're talking specifically about supporting those that have lost close family, friends, or loved ones due to the HIV/AIDS pandemic, folks that are in the LGBT community, what does that look like? Sometimes those losses can be very unique. And so when we have that experience and we know how those relationships impact that person, then we can offer specific support to them, helping them kind of navigate what does life look like in the absence of this person. What if the person that they've lost was their primary support person, right? So now how do they reach back out to the community? Where do they go in the community? Who can they trust in the community to get the support that they need? So I think it's really important that as we think about grief and we think about loss and we think about how do we help the community, is really identifying those safe spaces for people to go to and be able to ask for help, even when they're not quite sure what help they need or not quite sure what supports that they need, but they may just need a space to sit and just remember that person, or just hold space to just acknowledge the loss and just try to understand, how do they move forward.
And it's very interesting when you belong to, let's say, multiple communities, and
Yeah.
maybe you're not ready to sort of share with your communities that you've chosen a particular lifestyle, but you're living that lifestyle, or you're living in multiple lifestyles, and you lose a loved one in the lifestyle that people don't really understand, or people may not really fully get. And so the question is like, well, why is this so hard on you versus like some of the other things? And I love when you talk about finding a safe space and people who can relate, because if that was me, I don't know that I could share with my Aunt Betty that, this person who passed away was someone that I was seeing, because maybe for Aunt Betty, she has not embraced my lifestyle. And so she certainly wouldn't be the person I go talk to, but she's in my ear all day long asking me what's wrong, what's wrong, what's wrong. So in the community that understands and acknowledges what you're going through, they can help you answer Aunt Betty, right? They can give you some verbiage or some tools to use in terms of that, because a loss is a loss. When we talk about losses, it's the absence of something very close to you or very dear to you.
Yeah.
And so when that happens, sure, we know that eventually we'll be okay. And sure, we know that death is a part of life. But when that thing hits you, all those certainties that go out the window.
Out the window, for sure.
So yeah, finding that, and then there's this whole kick on research and initiatives and talking about, solutions for those who have or have been affected by HIV and AIDS. And does that mean life ends? No, there's a lot of scientific research out there that shows that, in fact, life continues. It's the mindset, it's putting yourselves in spaces where the research is happening. You may want to be a part of the research. You may want to participate in any of those clinical trials. Maybe you can find a support group within the research that's going on, and you get to collaborate with scientists and healthcare providers so that they can give you what you need to help improve the outcome and find a cure. And we may not be around for the cure, but as long as the research and the clinicals and the healthcare professionals are working together, then there is still hope, right? So thinking of that, thinking of still being hope, then there's this whole aspect of living a fulfilling life. What is that? And Stacey, I'm gonna start with you, because I talked about this earlier, that you were able to put it into those words for me, like death doesn't stop. You living. Tell us a little bit about that.
Right. So I think, kind of like I said earlier, when death happens and you lose that loved one, that moment feels so heavy and so hard. And sometimes just being able to catch your next breath can really be challenging. So you're the furthest thing from your mind is, what does life look like for me? How do I move forward? But I think it's so important that we do think about that when we talk about death, when we talk about grief. How do I pay homage to that person? How do I memorialize them, right? How do I continue to give meaning and fulfillment to their life through my life, right? So I think for me, I know like when I lost my parents, it was really hard for me. I was embarking on some new journeys in higher education. And I just, I was like, wow, like how do I gain these accomplishments? And they're not going to be here to share that, right? So I had to do my own healing work and recognize that they've instilled, all this greatness in me, and they were my biggest cheerleaders, throughout my life. And so getting my degrees and getting licensure and fulfilling the goals that I've set actually pays homage to them and memorializes them in a good way. So I tapped into that as a way of not kind of giving up and letting death overcome my life, right? So I take time. I remember my parents. I'm very intentional about remembering them and separating myself from the world to have those memories and to say, like, look at where I am now, right? And remembering what parts of them contributed to that. So I think, and again, engaging in those activities, remembering those relationships. I know when we talked about this, I talked about my mom's love for Keisha Cole. So sometimes, when things get a little rough or I'm missing her, I get my Keisha Cole going and I have my moments. And sometimes those are tearful moments. But ultimately they become joyful moments because I remember good memories of her enjoying that music, and I get into that place. So I think it's important that when you think of your loved one that you've lost, that you remember the good things that you shared, the good times that you shared, and continue to invest in your life and live a very full life, because that's what they would have wanted for you.
Nice. Brandy, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that kind of explained it. And I loved how, Stacey, you utilized your own personal experience and acknowledge, getting my degrees and all of that, and being reflective of some of those characteristics that you might have gleaned from your parents, because that's a great way of showing that process of, yeah, those were losses, but this is how I'm turning some of those losses into purpose now.
Yeah, and I just want to sort of put out there, when we're talking about grief and loss, it's not always planned, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, sometimes it is, but if you live anywhere near inner city right now, the gun violence is crazy. It's a lot. We're losing members of our communities left and right. And so in that instance, it's hard to find purpose because you're just trying to grapple the why, how, when will this stop? And those questions tend to take away from you living a full life of purpose because the death just didn't make sense. And so I don't want us to sort of negate the fact that we're also talking about the unforeseen deaths or losing people who I just talked to them last night, and then this morning I get the text or the news that they're no longer with us. And so the concept still applies to those as well. So good stuff, ladies. Now let's talk about the impact. We're talking about grief and loss. We're talking about how to navigate through this journey, but what are some of the impacts that we've seen based on losing people within the LGBTQ plus communities, within inner cities, within just from illness, people who've been sick for a long time and happen to pass? So what are we seeing as the impact of this?
Well, I would say, the greatest impact obviously is the loss of that person. And so how does it affect, individual families, right? What if that person was the breadwinner for the family, right? Now that changes the dynamic of how they survive. The fact that, again, sometimes loss is very unexpected. And so maybe, there was gun violence involved. And so that impacts also now the safety, right? Our safety. I think the other impact is when we experience grief and loss, by human nature, we also start to question our own mortality, right? And what does that look like for us? So I think those impacts then change our outlook and our perspective on life. And so how do we show up in the world, right? How do we show up for our families? How do we show up for our friends? How do we show up for community? And I think specifically in the LGBTQ community, again, as you mentioned earlier, sometimes families, friends, loved ones, they're not always supportive of a person's lifestyle. And so they may want to come in and maybe funeralize or memorialize this person in a way that contradicts to their lifestyle, right? So there's an impact there when you are the friend or you are the significant other or the important person in that person's world. How do you ensure that they still have dignity and respect and are remembered to who they really were? So I think there's a lot of impact that spans across grief and loss.
And hey, some of the impacts is like, I just don't feel like adulting today. I don't have it in me to do anything more. Instead of being at 100%, I am at 10%, I am at 20%. And that's okay, and I think oftentimes we push ourselves to function at 100% when we're really only able to give the world 50 or 60% for that day. And if that is the case, who else can we pull on from our communities to help us? Because there is an impact that death brings. And whether if it seems subtle and it grows, because there's the whole shocking or the denying of like, did this really happen? But at some point things settled. And I remember for me, with my major loss, I was the day that my previous husband passed away, my sister, who was like 20 something at the time, heard the news and put it on social media, RIP brother-in-law and his name, and then tagged me in it. So then everyone's like, wait, what? So people are calling, texting, showing up at the house. And everyone who showed up, I was like, do you want some water? Is there something I can get? Like, I was like hosting like a dinner party. And so I remember one of my closest friends saying to me, girl, you just lost your husband. You need to sit down. Let us take care of you. And I'm like, yeah, but I need to keep doing this because this is how I'm coping with it. And I remember like yesterday, once the funeral ended, and I always say once the body was lowered in the ground, it was like everything stopped. Everyone went back to life as normal for them, but I didn't have a normal life. I was like, wait, so what is my life gonna look like now? And I remember going back home and people came back to the house with me, but then they left. And then I was like sitting in this apartment that he died in his sleep. And I'm like, oh yeah, no, I can't stay here. I gotta move because I wasn't sleeping because I was afraid, like you mentioned, Brandy, that the same thing would happen to me. And so when, I have this thing, sleep has no mercy. So when I fell asleep, I would jump up like, wait, did I just fall? Like, where am I? Am I living still or am I waking up in another world? So it was very hard, the impact, but I forced myself to at least have a support of people around me. And I had supportive people who cooked. So when I was hungry, that's where I went. I had supportive people who talked. So if I wanted to stay up and not fall asleep, I would call them because they would talk for hours. I didn't even say it. They were just the one doing the talking. And then I had supportive friends where if I wanted to go somewhere and I didn't want to go by myself, I could call. So I literally remember sitting in the living room one day and making a list of people and putting them in different categories so that I could use that. Now, that was a moment though, because while I did that, I didn't always use it, right? And so just recognizing that all these things we're saying, this is generalistic stuff. It may not apply to you. None of it may, some of it may. You may create your own thing stemming off of what we're talking about. But this is just bringing awareness and giving you some tips and some tools that you can use or pass along to other people. So when we're talking about the impact, there are some other things that I think are very, very important for us to touch on. especially as we start talking about discrimination and stigmatization within the communities. Stacey, I'm gonna ask you to take the lead on this. And Stacey's so humble, y'all, but she worked with the LGBTQ community for so long. And when we were putting this together, there were so many like examples and stories that she was giving of how that the place where she worked was such a support for those in the community without judgment, without discrimination, without stigmatization. And so I'm gonna throw you out there, Stacey. Yes. So talk to us.
I got you. I got you. I got you. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, so I think I go into this work being very humble and understand I had some great experiences. Being, like I mentioned earlier, a native New Yorker and have an opportunity to work with some of the greatest LGBTQ organizations in New York, I was able to witness both stigma and discrimination firsthand, but also be a part of creating safe space and being a part of a welcoming community that definitely said, you are safe here, you are seen, you're heard, and you're valued in this space, and your loss and your experience with your loved one is valued. So I think for me, I think the like I spoke to earlier, sometimes families and friends, they're not very accepting, they're not supportive of a person's lifestyle, right? And so when you have a loss in this community, there may be a family that says like, hey, we're going to have this particular funeral, we're going to do these things because that coincides with their core value system, which is completely different from the person that is lost, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's a community of folks that are like, wow, I know this person on a totally different level. And in our community, this is how they showed up. This is what their value system looks like. And so I've been, a part of walking clients through losing folks where there was a very traditional service, traditional family grieving process, if you will, for lack of a better word. And then we in the LGBTQ community and allies of that community would then have a different service, right? And acknowledge the loved ones and the support that they received within the LGBT community. And that is all, unfortunately, because of the stigma and the discrimination that society has placed on the community. So people are not always able to grieve their loved one or their friend publicly because maybe the world didn't realize they were a part of that community.
Right. Exactly. That's interesting. Brandy, you want to add something to the loss of chosen families?
Yeah, so particularly for that, it speaks to what Stacey was mentioning. If your close people around you, family members or friends, aren't as supportive, individuals in the LGBTQ community may identify other people who are in that same community and identify them as their family members at that point. So what this is highlighting, when we're talking about the impacts of grief and loss, is highlighting the fact that if a person loses someone that they've chosen to be in their family members, it would have the same impact as it would if it was, a mom or a dad or a important figure in their life, if you will. And so that kind of speaks to that part. But I also want to talk about like the historical and interpersonal trauma too, because if we're talking about that community, we're highlighting the LGBTQ plus community here, but this historical and interpersonal trauma kind of speaks to any type of historical trauma that a group of people have experienced. So that can include slavery and genocide and things of that nature. So since we're highlighting this community, making ourselves aware of the fact that, they're not only the loss, but the fight,
right?
This community had to put up to be somewhat accepted. I think the goal is to be fully accepted, but the reality is, all of the world is not going to be fully accepting. And it's the same way with other communities as well. And so there's this constant fight to get to a certain place. So that's why we speak of advocacy and things of that nature. But when we're talking about grief and loss within the community, this just kind of makes that more complex because there has been such an ongoing fight to begin with.
And it intensifies the grief too, right? Because it brings back, all the things that you've been fighting, the rejection from your family members, the bullying from various communities, and it just makes the grieving process that much more intense. So as we're talking about that, Stacey, what are your thoughts in regards to this delayed grief? Like what is a delayed grief?
Right. So I think when you're talking about delayed grief, again, not having the safe space to grieve, right? So I know for me, when I lost my parents, the grief and loss process, I didn't have to shield anything, right? Like when people saw me grieving, when people saw me remembering my parents, that was acceptable, right? And people created space for me. I think in the LGBTQ community, from what I've experienced through client account, is that, sometimes there's a loved one in that community or, a significant other in that community, and you cannot openly grieve for them because the world is not so nice and not so accepting of that grief, right? And so you kind of just bottle it up inside. You try to suppress it as much as possible, and you never really given an opportunity to just grieve your loss, right? Because you have to be cognizant that maybe a visible expression of grief will put you in some danger, right? Or maybe expose a lifestyle that you haven't shared with family or friends. So I think when you talk about delayed grief and prolonging the grief process, that's definitely a factor within the LGBTQ community, which is why seeking support in supportive environments and safe spaces and being able to identify who those people are ahead of time is really critical in the grief and loss process.
And so when we're talking about disenfranchised grief, that sort of piggybacks right on the delayed grief of a community that individuals may experience this type of grief because society does not recognize or validate their loss. And I'm just gonna give another example of this. We've seen people lose their pets, like their dogs, their cats, their rabbits, their pets, and they take it very seriously because that was something very close and dear to them. But society, I think we're starting to come around to like the whole idea of I need therapy around losing my pet than let's say 10, 15 years ago. And while we're not quite there, but that is an example of society on a whole that doesn't put emphasis or it doesn't necessarily recognize or validate that kind of loss. I have yet to see any policies of any corporation that gives you days off because your dog died. Now, there may be some, and if you talk to your manager, you may have a day or two that they'll allow you to take off. But it's very different than when you're talking about someone who has died. And so this can also isolate individuals and impede their healing process too, because there are support groups for pets, for owners who've lost their pets. Again, we're getting there. We're not quite there yet, but we are getting there.
So Armina, I just want to, you brought up such an amazing point. I just want to highlight when you talk about like going to your employer, right, and asking for days off. So it's the same, like most employers have like a 3-day bereavement policy, right? But even in that policy, you are required to bring something to confirm your relationship, right, to this person. And they're very clear, a spouse, a child, a parent, an in-law, right? But again, what does that mean for the person who maybe this person did not express this is their lifestyle? And so in our world, right, I was your spouse, or in our world, I was, an in-law, right? But how do I bring that to prove to an employer that I'm going through this grief and I'm going through this loss and I need these 3 bereavement days? So again, things to think about when folks are dealing with grief and loss, and how that can look very different, just based on who the person is that you've lost.
Mhm.
Now, we just gonna touch on this, but if you want to learn more about this, you got to join us on Fridays. Another
Yes.
plug. On Friday, we'll be back and we're going to talk a little bit more about the disparities. We're going to show you some graphs and some charts over this. But Brandy, take this one away. So we're talking about health disparities. Tell us a little bit.
Yeah, so with grief and loss in general, like we had highlighted some of those impacts of that, but in addition to that, it can create an influx of anxiety for individuals, an influx of depression, and other mental health disorders, including substance abuse, because people they're trying to find ways to cope. And the feelings can be very overwhelming. So it can create mental health issues for individuals.
And if we even think about it, what one community may have access to and accessibility to, another community doesn't, right? Or that community may have it, but in order to tap into it, there's these questionnaires you have to answer. There's these things that then you got to talk to other. It's not easy accessible for some communities as it is for other communities. And I think about the pandemic and how some of us may have been low-key depressed or anxious, and then the pandemic comes. We have members of our communities or loved ones who are dying, and we can't even get closure. We can't go to a funeral. Maybe it's streamed, but then maybe it's not streamed. So some of us are still walking around with unresolved grief because of some of these health disparities. We didn't have some of those opportunities that others may have had in order to be able to get closure or to have the same access to healthcare to take care of some of these health needs as some other communities may. And so resiliency and strength, I love that word resiliency. I think of a rubber band and the snap back, snatch back, whatever you want to call it. Because if you pull a rubber band, no matter how many times you pull it, it has a snatch back. Now, the first time the snatch back is like, bam, right? But then as it goes on, it's a little weak, but it still is a rubber band. It doesn't lose its shape or form. And so we want to tell you guys that we all are resilient. We just got to tap into it. And it may be those support systems we've been talking through that can help you tap into that. It may be joining a community, getting counseling, advocating, and joining organizations like Philadelphia Fight and others that are out there that are there to give you the supports that you need. It's very vital to our recovery. It's vital to getting resources that we're going to need. And I like the V word of validation, because believe it or not, everybody, that's one of the things we like, is to be validated. So let's find resources and tools of people that can validate us, which will then give us our snatch back and also strengthen us back to where we were. Brandy, Stacy, do you want to add anything to this one?
I just was going to mention, this is something that we're going to dive deeper into come Friday. That is what our training is focusing on, is that resilience.
Yeah, so you got to come back, y'all. You got to come back. Okay. So, we're talking about the importance of addressing the community, providing support for grieving, creating inclusion, affirming spaces, promoting awareness and acceptance, and fostering support networks. This is how you're able to sort of move on to the next step. these things are in place, you move on in a healthy way. If these things are missing, the way life is, you're still going to move on. You'll just be pushed by life. And is there purpose in just being pushed by life? Is there purpose in just existing? Do we want to exist, or do we want to live a full and purposeful life? And so as we're looking at that, as we're coming on the bend now to the end of our presentation, let's talk through some ways we can cope with grief and loss. Stacy, tell us a little bit about, maybe how you've helped some of your clients through it. And then Brandy, you can jump right in after her in terms of ways people can cope with loss.
One of the things that I've seen throughout my practice is, clients coming in and saying like, and I think you mentioned this earlier, and I know it's happened to me, driving along the road and, not thinking about anything in particular. And then that emotion, the heaviness of the grief and the loss just overcomes you, and you just kind of stuck in that space. So one of the things that I do with clients that are coming in talking about grief and loss is kind of identifying how do we kind of take control of that emotion, right? How do we gain some of that control back? And so being very intentional about setting aside time to grieve. So I know for me, like I mentioned earlier, putting on my Keisha Cole, separating myself from everyone, crying, talking to my mom, praying, whatever it is that I needed to do in that moment, I did that. I was very intentional about that. So I think for me, that's one of the methods that I use in my practice with my clients, helping them set specific times to grieve, to think about the loss. I think the key is, again, the specific time, right? So not getting stuck there, not staying in that space, but setting aside 15 minutes, setting aside 20 minutes, depending on, where they are in the process. And I know we talk a little bit about the stages of grief and bereavement. So just depending on where they are, I've seen that to be really, really helpful with clients, because what starts out as a very heavy time gradually grows into this space of memory and joy. And then they find, like remembering their loved one is not so hard.
I've done that too. And I literally tell my clients to set a timer. When that timer goes off, that is your cue to business as usual. But if you feel yourself feeling sad, angry, confused, frustrated, all of those big emotions, it's okay to set a timer and just be in it. Notice, what are you feeling? What does your body feel like? What is your heart rate like? What does your stomach feel like? Do you feel hot? Do you feel cold? All of those things, because those are like symptoms of the emotions and the feelings, the big ones. And so that way you're ahead of it. So when you start to feel maybe your chest is beating a little hard, your heart is beating harder, or, that leg won't stop shaking, or your stomach is hurting and you just went to the bathroom, but you feel like you got to go to the bathroom again. Like, knowing all of those things helps you to identify where you're at emotionally and what emotional space are you in. I also tell them to avoid suppressing the feelings, because that prolongs the healing process.
Yeah. And so identifying those individuals, what I do with my clients, in addition to what you two have already mentioned, is also identifying those people, having them identify people in their corner that they can, speak to, that they can express feelings to, so that they're not holding that stuff. And in some cases, I've had a client where it was a mother that was lost, which for my client, her daughter experienced the loss of her grandmother. And so opening up, I encouraged my client, which was the mom, to have conversations with her daughter around that too, because of course, everybody's grieving differently. There's a level of difference in the type of relationship that each of them had, but at the end of the day, the loss was still the loss. And so being able to communicate that with each other, it brings, that joining aspect, so that you don't feel like you're still grieving this thing alone, but you also have this other individual who's very close to you as well, that's kind of going through the same thing. And so you can go through it together versus alone.
Yeah, and then there's the counseling piece again, you know, finding someone. And for me, the counseling piece is a non-judgmental person. Like
Right.
that's one of our biggest roles, is to be non-judgmental, is to provide a safe space, and not let our biases get in the way. So sometimes that needs to be at the beginning, because you need that strength, you need that resiliency pulled out. So definitely, you know, seeking someone. And we talked about the number of people that are familiar with self-care and use it to help cope. That is another way to cope with the grief and loss, is taking care of yourself.
Yes.
Physically, I mean, we can go physically, mentally, spiritually, all of those things, but you have to take care of you. The same thing you would do for your best friend or the neighbor down the street or the coworker is the same thing you have to do for you. I remember when my previous husband passed away, physically, I was weak. I wasn't eating. I wasn't really taking care of myself. I didn't have an appetite, and I didn't feel sleepy, but I was tired. But I wasn't taking care of myself. And so this is easy to say, so it's easier said than done, but we want you to be intentional. So intentionality is key, taking care of yourself physically, making sure that you're getting enough nutrients so that you could fight grief and loss, so that you can power through it. Can you imagine going to a fight or a war with a plastic fork and everyone else around you have like swords? Who's going to win that fight? You know, so get your nutrients in, eat, sleep, exercise regularly. And I'm not asking you to go join a gym. I'm just saying, if you're going to the market, park a little further in the parking lot so you can walk a little bit to the doors versus like the first available, either non-handicap or handicap spot. I am guilty of that, but I'm learning to park further away so I can get my steps in. And ensure that you're getting enough sleep. You know what enough sleep looks like for you.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say make sure you get 8 hours of sleep, because some people can function off of 6. Some people need 10. You know what enough is enough for you, so get that. So taking care of your physical health can really, in a good way, impact your emotional well-being. Self-cares, Stacy, Brandy, you want to chime in on this one?
Yeah, so it's essentially what you mentioned before, what we've kind of conveyed before, implementing and engaging in some of those things that really bring you comfort. Like yesterday was a long day for me. And so for me, I knew that, okay, I just want to wrap up in my fleece blanket and watch a good show. That helps me decompress, that helps ground me. And so it kind of goes back to, okay, knowing what works for you, and then doing those things.
Right.
Because that's a part of taking care of yourself.
Yeah, and I think we hear self-care of the outer things, like get your nails done, you know, get your facial.
Right.
Like,
no.
We're talking about getting a bubble bath somewhere. We're talking about finding that sweet sound that makes you happy, if music is your thing, and listening to it, listening to a book or reading a book, spending time in nature, deep breathing, drinking water, you know, drinking water with ice, or just those kinds of things that sort of can help ground you back, because the road for grief and loss is rocky. There's some smooth roads, there's some boulders on the road, there's some things where you gotta jump over and crawl under. You can't do all those things if you have not sort of prepared yourself for that journey. And the preparation happens on the journey, because it's simultaneously. It's not like you do those push-ups and you do those pump-ups, you're like, oh, I'm ready. No, you have to be on the course and doing, because remember what I said, life is still happening. If you stand still for 24 hours, it's going to be the next day for sure. It's not going to wait on you. So you have to find a way to navigate all of the nuances in life and still live. So expressing your feelings in a creative way. Some people are poets, some people are writers, some people are painters. I am none of those things, but I love music, so I will listen to some music. I was talking to Brandy and Stacy this morning, and I started off saying I woke up this morning and there's a song that came to mind where that's part of the lyrics, and they didn't know the lyrics, but once I said this, I'm like, oh yeah. But music is embedded in me. I can't play a lick of anything. I barely could sing a tone of anything, but it's my happy space. It's my happy place. And so finding ways that you can express your feelings in a creative way is also good on this process too. Anyone want to add to this slide?
No, I think that is spot on. I was mentioned, like Stacy mentioned earlier, about routines and structure, having those things in place and continuing, because of course, like you mentioned, Armina, grief can kind of have you standing still for a moment and life just continues on. But being able to tap back in to those things that you do on a regular basis can definitely help you through this process, because it alleviates that stuck feeling.
Yeah, I mean, and I think about the being patient with yourself, but this is like patient/kind, you know. It's easy for us to feel frustrated with ourselves, especially if for whatever the reason we feel like we could have done more to prevent the grief. We tend to beat ourselves up, and the guilt really kicks in with us. But in the midst of all of that, right, let's remember to show some kindness and be patient as we're going on the journey. The folks around us, they don't have to be patient, because they're going to be like, you still haven't gotten over that yet? You're going to hear those kinds of questions or those statements, but there is no set time for healing. I have clients who, after 2 or 3 sessions, they're frustrated that they're still doing the same behaviors. And I have to remind them of this very thing, like, you have to be patient because there is no timeline. You know, let's check in 60 days and see where you're at. That's a whole bunch of sessions between today and day 60, right? But you just got to be patient and allow the journey to happen the way it should. Give yourself time to grieve and be patient with the process. And remember that everyone copes differently. Brandy talked about a client she has where the grandmother died. So the mother and the daughter were both experiencing a loss, but maybe they were coping differently, and that is okay. It's okay to take as much time as you need to get through the process. And here, you know, we keep putting these plugs in here because we really are passionate. We're advocating for this for you all, that you seek professional help if needed.
I think that's key and critical, right? Being able to identify when grief and loss is really, overtaking your life and you're finding it really, really challenging to take that one step in front of the other. And so recognizing that there's nothing wrong with seeking professional help. And I love that you just highlighted that as clinicians, as therapists, we are a safe, non-judgmental space. And so people can come and seek professional help, knowing that, they can sit in their grief and loss and be seen and heard in that space.
So as we wrap up, we just want to leave you with a few more things, and one of the things is just to remember, again, that coping is unique to the individual. Like, you may join a support group, and everyone in that group, let's say, lost a cat, but the way that they're coping with it, the way that they're dealing with it is going to hit everyone differently. And so it's important to find strategies that work best for you. Be gentle with yourself during that process and allow the space for you to heal.
Yeah, so transforming loss involves finding meaning, direction in the face of difficult circumstances, or the loss of someone or something significant in your life. So while everyone's experience and paths are unique, we want to highlight some of these things that we've covered so far. So the fact of allowing the time to be the time for your journey, as well as being patient and being kind with yourself, reaching out if you need that support. And just remembering that you're not alone in this journey. Like we highlighted, there are groups out there, and utilizing social media and other platforms can be very helpful in finding those other individuals that may be dealing with a similar loss.
Mhm. And I would just add to that, just the idea that this is a unique process, it's an individual process. So don't be discouraged in seeking support because you feel like you should be at a particular place or should be feeling a certain way. Just, as we said, be kind, be gentle to yourself, and accept that this is where you are in your process of grief and loss.
Absolutely. And we want to thank everyone for hanging in there with us. It's a lot of information. Grief and loss is a big bubble, but this is where it starts. We tackle one step at a time, one issue at a time. And so we have created sort of like a one-pager of some of the things we talked about. If you were interested in getting that from us, our phone, we prefer you email us. So we have your email address and we can just reply back to your email. If you're looking for therapy and you're looking for ways to get connected, our phone number is on here as well. So our email is hello@azuleconsultinggroup.com. And our phone number is 302-922-1767. And we want to thank Philadelphia Fight for bringing us on to talk about such an important topic in such an amazing month. And so let the festivities continue. Thank you.